So, Jamie, one of the things that I found, I love your use of the word cultural liturgies. And I know sociologists have used this kind of language of subculture. And kind of in the context I work, which tend to be primarily with African American young people who come from kind of more impoverished areas, sometimes there is this kind of subcultural kind of way of being and way of living that's different from mainstream society, but I find your language of cultural liturgy so important, and almost thinking that there's kind of like these subcultural liturgies that that young people are being shaped and formed in particular ways. And what I realized, particularly from reading some of your work, is sometimes these liturgies can be very violent. For instance, just the ways in which young boys and girls in certain communities are taught to have a particular type of attitude or a particular type of defensiveness. And it's not just shaping their desires, but it's actually protecting them, right? From, I mean, there has to be a particular way of being in a way of doing that they've learned from very young, because they have to survive in particular type of communities. And so I guess I was trying to think through, and I would love for you to unpack, like, you know, how do we reteach, retrain young people who are not just shaped because of kind of their desires, but they're shaped because of how they have to live and be in the world. How do we retrain them to have new desires and new habits and new practices that are, you know, life-giving?
Right. And it's and to do that in such a way that doesn't just look like, oh, they have to conform to the dominant culture.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Because my hunch is that actually all kinds of liturgies, rituals of the dominant culture are able to be what they can be only because they've actually shuffled off the need for violence elsewhere. Do you know what I mean? Like they've almost farmed it out so that they have the privilege of getting to look like they don't have to be like that.
That's exactly right.
I think it's one of the hopes for this sort of framework of thinking about things is that it would help us to appreciate how messy and complex and nuanced things are, right? And so I think I understand what you're talking about. And in my understanding of that, we live in the core city, and what I see is actually communities that are very intentional about their liturgical formation, right? And I don't think it's way too easy for then those who take for granted the liturgies of the dominant culture to just sort of demonize or otherize those and fixate on, say, the violence, and not appreciate what you got at, which is, well, wait, these are actually rhythms of survival that have been cultivated partly because of what the dominant culture has sort of set up and carved out. So I think, especially if I imagine what youth ministry looks like in a context like that, is it can't simply look like, bad forms of civilizing projects that we carried out in the name of colonialism as missions, right? It has to, because then it doesn't actually realize there's probably always there's like a light and shadow side to all of these kinds of dynamics, and so that there's a forging of solidarity that bears marks of exactly what the church should be, is a community of solidarity. And it might be that the church is actually doing a terrible job of forming people in solidarity because we just have turned it into me and Jesus, and it's this privatized experience. So I think it at the same time, we want to invite people into the story of the Prince of Peace. So I imagine it looks like people embedded in communities who understand the complexity like you do, and don't imagine that there's just this easy switch that can be flipped. I think it's a really, really important question, and I think you're right that thinking about it from this frame changes it from a moralism or a legalism that's just like, oh, well, why are you doing that? Now we understand, no, this is actually sort of a water that people swim in, and what it looks like to invite them to swim differently, maybe, or something like that. Yeah. Not to simply imagine, oh, you can go to another pool.
Right.
No. This is my pool, but how can I swim differently and not drown?
Right.
Yeah.
And I think part of like this whole lecture series for the summer is, we know that young people can't just always escape suffering.
Exactly.
But part of what they have to do is learn how to survive and to navigate the water, so to speak. And that part of my job, our job as faith communities, youth ministers, is, like you said, teaching them how to navigate that water.
Yes, exactly. And to help them see the water, as it were. Do you know this parable? David Foster Wallace uses it actually in his commencement address at Kenyon College, where these fish, two young fish are swimming, and the older fish swims by and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And they swim by and they look back and they're like, "What's water?" And in a sense, I think helping young people just realize, this is all they've ever known, and just giving them the critical capacity to see the liturgies in their lives, I think is actually the beginning of them taking ownership of their faith as well.
Right.